All right, dear colleagues, we are happy to continue our conference today with a presentation by KU's own Professor Mariya Omelicheva from the Department of Political Science and my immediate predecessor as the director of our center. It's wonderful to have you back, and all of us look forward to hearing insights from your recent research. Welcome.
Do I use this or the keys?
I use the arrows.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. And for the full disclosure, I'm not an expert on migration like our keynote speaker is. Most of my research focuses on organized crime, terrorism, counterterrorism, drug trafficking, and the nexus of crime and terrorism. So I sort of worked on this presentation specifically for this conference, partly because I was able to amass considerable amount of data as part of another grant from the Department of Defense Minerva Initiative that allowed me to do some statistical tests of a question that I was personally curious about. Also partly because of the rhetoric that we hear from the current administration as far as the relationship between crime and migration is concerned. So, and also some of my work on human rights also led me to be curious about this question of the relationship between migration and crime in Russia. And I will start by saying that we're arguing that Russia has never been a country of migrants, and I'll clarify why in a second. Well, since the rule of Catherine the Great, it has seen periods when migrants were invited from abroad, but their role as a democratic factor remained very insignificant. So if we think about Russia in its current borders as the Republic of the USSR, it was a country of emigration to other Soviet republics rather than country of immigration. And as we all know, most of that emigration was not by will. It was, either forceful deportation or it was just, sending labor to build magnificent dams or plants or other large projects. And the situation changed a little bit towards 1970s, 80s, when the number of immigrants to Russia outweighed the number of immigrants. So it kind of balanced out the depopulation, the loss of the Russians in the previous couple of decades with the wave of immigrants that were coming from Russia from the other Soviet Union republics in 70s and 80s. But I do want to qualify it by saying that lots of those so-called migrants were the ones that were were forcefully sent to either Central Asia or the Caucasus or other parts of Russia. So there was remigration rather than migration that partly explains that migration wave. And obviously, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the early 1990s and the middle of 1990s, they saw another remigration wave with some Russians who found themselves in the former Soviet Union republics returning to Russia, but also some non-Russians. And but here I am using Russians very loosely, not in a sense of ethnicity like Ruski, but Russian ethnic Russians, but also Russians by nationality, as in Россияне. All right. So another point to mention here is that this most recent remigration wave also coincided with important changes in the demographics of Russia. So that was the time when Russia's natural population growth was in decline because of the decline in dropping birth rates. And so Russia was able to maintain its population growth because of the influx of migrants. So that's was the time when migration did became to play a considerable demographic factor in the Russian Federation. All right. So, but this is the point I wanted. This is the graph that illustrates the point I was trying to make at the beginning, which is to say that Russia is not the country of immigrants. So on the one hand, indeed, if you look at the absolute, the raw numbers, Russia is second to only the United States in terms of the absolute number of immigrants to Russia. I would also to qualify that, United States accounted for over 40 million migrants in 2010. Russia was a distant second with just over 10, 12 or 20? 12? Yeah, okay. But it was, considerably fewer migrants, and then Germany was on the third place. But if we look at the net migration, which is the difference between the number of persons entering and leaving a country during the year per 1,000 persons based on the mid-year population, we will see that, Russia has maintained a positive net migration, meaning that the number of those entering country has been always higher than the number of those leaving the country. I said that. But in terms of when we adjust this migration inflows to the total number of people living in Russia, so we put these numbers in perspective. Russia immediately falls below quite few countries in Europe, including Switzerland and Spain and Norway and et cetera, et cetera. So this is the net migration into Russia and some European countries in 2008 and 2010 per 1,000 residents. Just to give you another example to illustrate this point, in 2010, Russia had 1.8 billion children born in the country, which is more than in any other European country. But this is not to say that Russia had higher birth rate than any other European country. So again, even though in the absolute numbers, in terms of absolute figures numbers, Russia has had the second largest number of immigrants coming into the country. In terms of the net migration, it has been lower. Okay, but this is not how the Russians perceive the situation with migration in their country. The rhetoric of some of the policymakers, the discourse that is transpiring in the mass media publications is that the country is submerged under the flood of migrants. So the migrants are inundating the country. So Levada Center, one of the remaining independent pollsters in Russia that was recently named as foreign agent, so I don't know how much independence they've exercised right now, but at the time, one of the trusted sources that lots of American researchers, sociologists, and political scientists rely on for getting public opinion data. So in 2016, Levada found that 40% of those used in that questionnaire, surveyed in the questionnaire administered by Levada, believed that immigrants were responsible for an increase in crime, and 62% of those thought that immigrants were taking jobs from Russians. Of course, there was a considerable a significant level of support to reduce immigration and to strengthen anti-immigration policies. But that was somewhat a reduction compared to 2014. In 2014, it was 80% plus of Russians supporting reducing immigration to Russia. And then there was also this widespread feeling or belief that immigrants did nothing to help the country's economy or did nothing to enrich Russian society. Okay? So these are the public perceptions, pretty recent ones from 2016. And I use this widely cited quote from the, I think he's one of the top law enforcement officials in Moscow, a commissioner of police, Vladimir Kolokoltsev. So he was quoted as saying that migrants are responsible for 70% of Moscow's crime, and the rate of this crime has been growing, that Central Asians are rapists, and the crime of rape also saw increase from 2013 to 2014 by almost 80%. Again, this is just a one illustration. You don't need to spend too much time, especially if you have Russian. You Google, you get plenty of assertions of this kind coming from the public officials across the country. And what complicates or exacerbates, inflates these perceptions of immigrants as contributing to crime is this concurrent narrative associated with foreign fighters from Russia or from Central Asian republics and from Caucasian republics who are recruited in Russia and they go to Syria and Iraq to fight for ISIS or for other groups. The numbers differ, and I'll show you two different charts with somewhat varying figures. But the experts agree that the number of Russia is on the second place to Middle Eastern countries in terms of the number of foreign fighters from Russia fighting in Syria and Iraq. So again, most of the fighters come from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and a few other Middle Eastern countries. So this estimate is a little bit higher, says place Russia's foreign fighters at 2,400. Considerably fewer, but still, given smaller populations of the Central Asian republics, different estimates place the number of foreign fighters from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan in a few hundreds. That still has been a big concern for the governments of those states. But in Russia, what the media has been talking about is that there are all these Central Asian or migrants from predominantly Muslim countries coming to Russia, and they become radicalized, and they go and fight in Syria. The most recent example is, of course, the bombing in St. Petersburg subway. Immediately, the culprit was found, recently nationalized, formerly Kyrgyz youngster, Russian citizen of Kyrgyz origin, in a day following the accusation of the gentleman in committing this horrendous crime. A group of Central Asians, I think 6 or 8 of them, was detained on the charges of recruiting Central Asians, the laborers in Russia, to fight in Syria. And when I was reading this story, so all of those different cells or groups of al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and ISIS, they were clumped together, and the allegations were made that this group is recruiting Central Asians to fight for either one of them, even though they don't see eye to eye. So there are lots of different things that once you start really teasing those narratives apart, lots of inconsistencies. But all I'm trying to say here is that this other narrative of dangers associated with Islam. So as we all know, the citizens of Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia, and other regions from Russia's North Caucasus, they've always been perceived with suspicion as kind of that potential terrorists. These are, perceptions are not completely baseless, but Russians are sort of kind of clamping different types of different ethnic groups that reside in North Caucasus together. They're all Caucasians. And different ethnicities that reside in Central Asia, all Central Asians, so there have been no discrimination in terms of, who is who. And so this narrative of danger associated with Islam, Muslim radicalization, especially of the laborers coming from predominantly Muslim territories, places, has been feeding in that another narrative of crime associated with migration. So they've been sort of going hand in hand, and one influencing the other, kind of amplifying the perception of danger coming from immigrants. And again, I'm not necessarily a theorist of either crime or migration. I did look at a variety of literature coming from criminology on crime, and I do my own research in terrorism. So in the context of Russia, which has been infamous for history of prejudice and negative stereotyping and racism, pretty much all the same groups that's been those negative others, they've been perceived as a greater danger, as a greater threat. So one of the things that the previous presentation alluded to was that the migrants have some of the characteristics that are typically associated with the native-born criminals. So when we think about, or at least when Russians think about criminals, they think about poorly educated, low income, and the immigrants who come there, plus they sometimes don't speak Russian really well, so they are the carriers of some of the characteristics that native-born criminals would have. Like I said, lower education, no income, unemployed or low income, and some others. And then outside of Russia, there are kind of some statistical and non-statistical explanations as to why we can find an association between, kind of positive association between crime and migration. It could be partly due to the overrepresentation of immigrants in the criminal justice system because of the bias that pervades those criminal systems, that crime in total may include lots of accounts of immigration-related crimes. So those offenses may sort of inflate the numbers for crime associated with migrants. So that can drive this perception that more migrants, more crime. And then, and as I said, the racial and ethnic discrimination by police and the judicial system may also contribute to those findings that suggest that more migration leads to more crime. So just to say that there have been studies done. The jury is still out there, even though there is more consensus seems to nowadays more consensus seems to be with regard to more migration, less crime. Still, there are findings. There are studies out there that offer findings suggesting that there is a positive relationship between migration and crime. Anyway, so so there is this portal Pravovoi Statistiki. This is a beta, according to the portal, according to this website. This is a portal that is still in kind of a trial stage, but it's been working really, really well. I hope that it's going to stay there, but I scrapped as much data as I could possibly could. And so what it does is it provides information at the provincial level on total number of crimes of different categories, the gravest, not so grave, rape, no rape. And more importantly, it also has the social portrait of crime and provides a variety of demographic characteristics, age, gender, education on crimes and criminals. Of course, we can talk about how much we can trust this data in the Q&A. For this presentation, I think an argument could be made is that if anything, the numbers on migrants are inflated. So like, if indeed the law enforcement officials are sort of tasked with, or they feel like they need to provide figures that fit into the narrative that migrants are a danger. I mean, if anything, I would expect that those numbers are a little bit higher, maybe not. So again, we can talk about whether or not we can trust this data. So, but this is what the data suggests. So looking overall at the aggregate, I only presented data for 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. I could have added, previous few years, but the graphs would have looked boringly similar. What this suggests, so this graph breaks down the total numbers of all those accused in crime by citizenship, and it's not in raw numbers because the raw numbers are really, 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 really large. It's in percentages, and what this shows is that non-citizens they really constitute a very, very small portion, less than 10% of all those accused in all kinds of crime across Russia. Okay, and then the migrants are also selected into a separate category, so you can't really sum them up. So migrants, I just added that category for illustration purposes, so you can some non-citizens and citizens, they will constitute 100%, but then there's also a separate category of migrants, and those are anywhere between 0.7%, 0.7 to 1.2, 1.3, depending on the year. So according to Russia's own statistics of crime, for pretty much every year for which the data is available, I think starting at 2008, the percentage of non-citizens committing crime and considerably lower than percentage of citizens, and the percentage of migrants is below 1, with a little bit higher than below than 1 on any given year. And so I was curious to see what's going on in Russia, in Moscow, because remember that quote that I used from Kolokольtsev, I'm sorry, yeah, Kolokольtsev. So I was very curious to see what's going on in Moscow and a few other regions, but only Moscow here. So the numbers are a little bit higher in 25 to anywhere between 18 to 25% of all those accused in crime are non-citizens. The percentage of migrants is very low, was a little bit higher, about 2%, hovering just above 2% in 2014. All right, and so as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, I've been able to collect a lot of provincial level data, meaning that so we have 80 plus provinces that constitute the Russian Federation, regions, oblasts, you name it. And as part of the other project, we've been collecting data on crime, on terrorism, on drug trafficking, and a variety of socioeconomic, demographic, and not political conditions. We're still getting there. We're looking at the ways to measure democracy at subnational level, but we've collected quite some data from Russia's former Gostat, the official statistical agency in there. And I will spare you of the discussion of all of the models that I played with for this presentation. So there are a variety of contributors to crime. Some of those are socioeconomic, other are demographic, still others are political. So again, this is just one particular example of a model. And for all other models, there were some differences in terms of direction and significance of other variables, and I will go over those in a minute. The thing that has remained stable is this. So no matter what, so I ran maybe like 20, 30 models with different control variables. So the net migration variable that I defined before, it has always been negative or statistically insignificant. So the other control factors, infant mortality is sort of kind of that measure of, sometimes it's used as a measure of poverty, because there is no direct measure of poverty in that data set. There is also no direct measure of gross national product at the provincial level, so we'll use financial result, which is kind of all of the revenues minus all of the losses made by all of the enterprises in the province as sort of a proxy for how well that province has been doing economically. Well, gender ratio speaks for itself. Then I included a couple of variables measuring unemployment of all those in 20s and all those in 30s, control for population, percentage of those living below minimal wage for that province, net migration, and constant. Again, I can speculate about or talk about all other findings, but I think what I was interested in the most for this particular presentation is the impact of net migration on crime. So one model, the first column is so the total number of crime committed per province per year, and then the second model is on total number of terrorist crimes committed in that province in that year. And as I said, in any specification of the model, regardless of what control variables I would be using, I didn't really find a positive, statistically significant relationship between net migration and total crime and terrorism. So, outside of Russia, where there have been analysis suggesting that this assertion that migration drives crime is a myth. So outside of those analyses in Russia, the United States recently has had this census data that was used very widely in the media to try to debunk this myth that migration drives crime, that in the context of the United States, the migrants' rate of crime is 1/5 of that of native born, and that those who are so I'll just stop there. So the rate of crime by the migrants is 1/5 of those born in the United States, and so these same findings have been confirmed in the studies of migration in a number of other states. One thing that we kind of talked about how remittances are important for survival, even though they're not so important in terms of creating development and entrepreneurship and contributing to education. But labor migrants are really, really important for Russia as well, not only as a boost to its dwindling demographics, but also as an important menial labor that Russians themselves don't want to do. So labor migrants, returning migrants, and student migrants, as well as refugees, make a major contribution to Russia's demographic and labor potential, especially labor potential. So again, it would be interesting to look at how much they contribute to construction, to services, to other areas of the market. And okay, I shouldn't overemphasize that it's kind of this friendly integration and cooperation, but okay, there is politics in everything, including the kind of regional cooperative initiatives that are spearheaded by China and Russia, mostly by China and Russia there. But even those initiatives would be very, very difficult to spearhead because of the distrust of the elites, because of the fears of Russia's hegemony, because of the lack of resources. If you want to have a regional entity, you've got to have resources to maintain it, to pay for it, to pay for staff, to pay for personnel. So, but those kinds of ties based on migrant networks do contribute to maintaining ties and contributing to political integration between countries of the former Soviet Union. And so, as you know, Tajikistan is not a member of the Eurasian Union that was rolled out a couple of years ago in 2015, I believe. And Russia has been using labor migration as a stick to push Rahmon to join Eurasian Union. And I think they would have hadn't it been for the crisis that plagued Russia, because unfortunately for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, both countries really, really hoping to benefit from the access to Russia's market and also with the labor situation. Because of Russia's own economic crisis, it's severely affected macroeconomic indicators in the members of Eurasian Union. So I think that's been holding Tajikistan back as one of the reasons. Okay, so that's my very short spiel on the relationship between migration and crime in the context of Russia, and I am happy to answer your questions if you have any. Yes.
I'll come to you, Ray. Do you think on your statistics, do you think on the crime, the average Russian differentiates between a migrant and a non-citizen? Do you think that an average Russian would make that distinction? In this country, I'm not sure we make that distinction.
Yeah, I agree with that, particularly because Russia granted lots of citizenships, between 2011 and 2015, lots of those labor migrants received citizenship. So, yes, again, in the context of, this sort of, I don't want to call it study, it's kind of my, curiosity about this question. I would say that it wouldn't really matter in terms of, even if there was no difference and they were like, okay, migrants, the numbers are still low, minus, if you take out some of the major cities and areas that attract a lot of migrants, the average per province per year, the numbers for non-citizens for crime are still pretty low.
I just wonder how somebody like General Kolokotsev could have made that comment that 70% of crimes in Moscow are being committed by migrants. I mean, statistics don't bear that.
No, they don't. They don't. So again, the point is to invalidate this narrative that lots of politicians and the Russians so strongly believe in. I do have a question for you as you were thinking about question, because this is something that I struggled with when I was. So those are also absolute numbers, and they don't indicate the rate of crime. What I was trying to get at, and I couldn't because there is no data on the. There's data on there's. So there's data on net migration. Okay, that net migration means all those coming, all those leaving per 1,000 people. So what I would like to get is the rate of crime. So if I knew the absolute numbers of migrants and or non-citizens per year per province, then I would have gotten at the rate of crime that would have given a much, much better picture and than what I just presented to you, but I could not find it. There is data on refugees, internally displaced, asylum seekers, but those are really tiny. Russia has been receiving very, very few of those. If anyone knows of the raw numbers per year per province, not Russia as a whole, but provincial level data on the raw numbers of migrants, however defined, let me know.
No. Could you say something about student migrations? We never hear about that. How does it still, or what degree does it exist? Is it from the border and from Uzbekistan can send the son to Moscow, which is a very expensive city? Perhaps might as well send it to a European country. Or how does it work? Thank you.
So based on my research in Central Asia, and this research did not focus on this question specifically, but we did talk, and I did look into, some of the indicators of, where do the students from Central Asian states in particular go. Obviously, if the families can afford it, their number one choice would be, Western institutions. And you know that in Kazakhstan, Balashak program was able to send quite few talented Kazakhs to study in Europe and in the United States. For a while, Russia's institutions dominated. So that was a number one priority of sending the children to study abroad. But Russia has not been able to retain its kind of dominant place now, send students to China, South Korea. For a while, when the borders were a little bit freer for those interested in pursuing religious education, Egypt and a few other Middle Eastern countries offering stipends and scholarship and paying for the education. They attracted a lot of Central Asian students. I do want to add one more thing, though, that Russia still holds a dominant position as far as sort of certifying dissertations is concerned. So Central Asians who want to get Kandidat Nauk degree, so the Central Asians studying, getting post-secondary education, right? So if they want to get Kandidat Nauk degree, so they defend their dissertation in their local institutions, but then it's going to be sent to an institution in Russia to get the certification to validate or to really get that degree. So Russia still maintains sort of influence and control in that area.
Hey, Mariya, thank you very much. My question is what do you think there is in terms of the population increasing, staying the same, or decreasing in terms of its buy-in to the propaganda, frankly, of the high rates of the involvement of migrants in crime, you know, in Russia or Moscow. I mean, I'm just trying to get a feel for, you know, if the predominant data that you show said, well, wait a minute, you know, we have officials saying, quoting some levels, real specific numbers of data, which doesn't seem to be accurate at all. And then there was the survey of the population in the 60s, some below it, but, you know, more than half, saying, yeah, we think that crimes are caused by migrants. My question is that a rising number? Or is the population likely to be predicted to come up to the level of the you know, martial police of Moscow? Or is the population level off because they, you know, they're subtracting 10% because the government said it, I'm not going to believe it? Or is it potentially a decreasing number? As more migrants are made citizens, as you know, more labor is required, and there's an ameliorating effect of that.
Okay, so unfortunately, this data is available for, I think it was 2015, 2016. It doesn't reflect too much what the World Bank and some other organizations. So if we look at the remittances, they dropped. So then the expectation would be that the number of migrants would drop too. So I have not seen that in the statistics. So I don't have an answer as to why. Just looking at the trends, as you know, what the trends that the data suggest, I have not seen, you know, there's like a little fluctuation, but the standard deviation of like tiny. So again, the reports on crime committed by migrants or by non-citizens, they will fluctuate here and there, like 0.2, 0.4% of that or down, but it wouldn't be like a considerable drop or rise. So I haven't seen any fluctuation in trends there, but I also have not seen a drastic drop in the number of migrants that I probably would have expected to see, given that the reports are suggesting that the number of remittances dropped. So I don't have an explanation to that phenomenon yet. One thing that I didn't reflect on during my presentation is, you know, so there are all these theories and explanations as to why migrants should commit more crime. There are fewer that will help us understand why shouldn't they. And then as I was listening to the presentation, I began thinking about it. And I think one of the possible explanation is that those people come in with lots of social obligations and responsibilities. So the nature of the individuals who come in, who have a whole village dependent on them, and those are still, the social fabric of those societies is very, very tight. You know, social pressure, you know, the level of responsibility and pressure they're under. So they are not just to benefit from crime. They're there with long-term, they don't know when they're going to leave, and they know that there are a lot of people that are dependent on them. You know, coming in with this kind of mentality, these are not the kind of individual that will look for committing crime. You know, granted, you know, they may become involved in drug trafficking and whatnot, so yes, they do commit crime. But to suggest that they are the ones who commit crime at a higher rate seems to be counterintuitive to what we hear about why they migrate in the first place. And I think this is one of the explanations that was suggested for, you know, why we see migrants committing crime at a much lower rate in the United States, because the nature of the migrants, the modern day migrants in the United States, is also very different from what we saw, you know, a few decades ago.
So, Mariya, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I wanted to pick up on this last element, and I want to commend you because it is really difficult to get to these slippery numbers, and we've seemed to have traveled very far, both in Russia and the United States, from this idea of he or she who asserts must prove. It's actually, I can say whatever I want, and then you can try and disprove it, and it's really challenging. So just two quick little elements. Jeff Bissell at the Pew Research Center has done a lot of work on the criminality of migrants in the United States. And in the US, as in Russia, it's really difficult because most migrants aren't registered, and so they don't show up in population statistics. And what they have done is just really use not net migration, but simply in-migration from specific regions. So in the US, no one is really targeting those French immigrants as much. So we're really looking at Latin America, particularly Mexican immigration into the southwest, but most of that is Latin American anyways, but I digress. I'm just curious if in your modeling, which looks really fascinating, if you've looked at just the percentage of the population, say, of Central Asian ethnicity, regardless of citizenship, as a proxy variable, because what Jeff found in the United States was at the county level that was seemed to be picking up, because if you're unregistered and you're marginal, you're going to move someplace where there are other co-ethnics, because that's where your network's going to be. And so that might be, I'd love to hear your opinion on taking that approach to it. And then secondly, with a little bit of experience with these folks and those numbers, so when pressing on them, because it's not just about crime, it's also about health. They generate all disease in the Russian Federation, which is interesting. And sarcastic as I am, I was like, alcoholism too? And then they kind of got quiet. At any rate, one of the arguments against that is that most of the demographers are arguing that there's 3 unregistered migrants for every registered migrants. So by that definition, 75% of migrants are criminal because they're not registered. Is that a way that they slide around it? So just your opinions on that. Thanks for the presentation.
Oh, no, thank you so much for the questions. So the first one is easier to tackle. So no, I didn't do that. So those portals provide a wealth of information that is very difficult to scrap, so you still have to do a lot of manual labor of really inputting it all in Excel and then the statistical packets. The Russians do publish a statistical bulletin on various indicators at the region, and I saw percentages of different ethnicities living. What they wouldn't tell us is whether or not those are naturalized or like first or second generation. So there is a way to get at the kind of ethnic makeup of those regions, and this is something that we would like to do because this is going to be very, very useful for a variety of projects, conflict or whatnot. So we will get at that, and I know that data is available. So we will do that. And I do want to also comment on Pew Research, which I consulted also to learn how to go about this research. And a lot of things that they publish about migrants and crime is based on individual level questionnaires where they ask individuals to self-report. Okay, and so there have been obviously criticisms as to whether or not they're going to underreport, the extent to what they know someone who committed crime or you yourself been engaged in crime. So like yeah, we all know what the problems are with self-reports about anything. So, but then there have also been studies done in the United States checking on whether or not the self-reporting on crime biases crime reporting. And they found that no, if anything, that the margin of underreporting crime is so insignificant. It's okay. I was like, oh, great, worked in the United States, but it's a side note, but it's lots of challenging of studying these kinds of questions. And then with regard to the last point about what do we do, if indeed. For each registered immigrant, we have 3 unregistered ones. Okay, I need to check because my intuition is that those non-citizen statistics they will cover both registered and unregistered, and some of the unregistered will be either detained and persecuted and put in jail or sent back to their home countries for incarceration. So I think, not perfectly, but at some level, the data on non-citizens committing crimes in Russia captures some of those unregistered migrants. That's my, feeling, my intuition about that. But I think there can also be sophisticated ways to, if your research shows that on average, we have this ratio of legal and illegal migrants, how do we can add, statistically we can control for that discrepancy in our models and sort of, and control for this discrepancy between illegal and illegal migrants statistically in the model. So that's one way. And then, as I mentioned, that we should also be careful because some of those illegal migrants are charged with violation of migration laws. And this become a part of the statistic of crime. So then we are inadvertently going to be inflating the crime statistic, and then we're going to be charging migrants for crime, but this is the crime that, they're illegal immigrants. So we have to be careful about that as well, because as some of the studies that I alluded to in my presentation that reported the link between migration and crime, the findings were partly because the total statistics on crime included crimes violating migration legislation. So.
Dear colleagues, let's please give Professor Mariya Omelicheva a round of applause. Thank you very much for her presentation.